What's going on, Wildcats? Happy Wednesday. Today we are doing our second set of notes for this week's remote learning. Today we're going to look at technological advancements in the United States. Basically, it's a version of the Industrial Revolution, and we'll get to what that means as we progress through our notes today. Remember, if I'm going too fast for you guys at any moment, feel free to pause the video so that you are able to copy down all the notes. As we continue on for remote learning, it's kind of towards the end, we're going to have a note turn in for our final grade in the grade book. So going back to our technological advancements, we're really going to focus on 4 during this lecture, and then we'll talk about a 5th one at the start of next week when we start talking about the events that led up to the American Civil War. So in the early 1800s, or really all throughout the 1800s, we start to see a uptick on the different types of advancements that are going to be made in regards to technology all throughout the United States. Some of these can be infrastructure like suspension bridges. In regards to farming, we're going to start seeing the development of a combine harvester in about 1834. In about 1808, we are going to see the first car that was powered by hydrogen. 1870, we're going to see the first gasoline-powered combustion engine, and a handful of other items are going to be developed during this time. Throughout this lecture, I also will reference to what was going on over in Europe, like Great Britain, for example, because they were really the leaders in regards to the Industrial Revolution. Our first advancement that we're going to see is steam-powered factories. In regards to factories, we're really going to focus on the textile or the cloth or clothing making factories. Before we start to see steam or water powered factories, all the textile items like clothing were all done by hand, usually done by the women inside of a family. So one of the earliest factories are going to be used by water. Most of these factories, not only for steam or water, they're all going to be up in the northeastern part of the United States. Kind of think of those New England states, since there's an abundant amount of waterways such as rivers and streams that are going to be able to power these machines. So as we see here with the typical mill site image, there is water all around this mill or factory. The rushing water is going to flow and push the circle, or excuse me, the wheel, I should say, which is labeled W, which is connected to a machine. As it's spinning, that's going to generate the power that the machine needs to actually function. However, when we have the creation of steam-powered factories, we are really going to be able to start popping up factories all throughout the United States, just because we do not need a running water source to power our machines. However, since we are able to pop them up everywhere, they're mostly going to be in the north. The South is still focusing on agriculture, and there is a new crop that we'll get into next week called cotton. Lots of immigrants are going to start making their way here to the United States to come work in factories. There's a handful of push-pull factors that are going to draw these immigrants to come and work in the United States. The push factor, what's causing them to leave their homeland, is the fact of poverty. There are some political hardships going on. The potato famine is really impacting the Irish. Some pull factors are going to be the fact that the United States are going to have newer factories. They're going to have a lot more jobs that are going to pay well, but also better housing and food. These extra workers are going to usher in the United States into the Industrial Revolution. Basically, the Industrial Revolution is a period of rapid growth in using machines for manufacturing and production that begins in the mid-1700s. All of this really starts off in the 1700s in Europe, like in Great Britain. Great Britain was so far ahead compared to the United States that the British Parliament actually passed some laws that made it illegal for skilled workers like mechanics or any type of machine blueprints to leave Great Britain. There was one brave soul, Mr. Samuel Slater, that actually disguised himself as a farmer and was able to make his way to the United States. When he comes to the United States, he's going to set up his first mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, kind of like the Pawtucket Brewery in Family Guy, where he is going to find another American that's going to help. About the time of his death, he had roughly 13 mills underneath his name. So he was the real trendsetter in regards to developing these different factories inside of the United States. Many companies are going to build factories in cities where there was large numbers of workers. But about 1820, really at the start of the Industrial Revolution here in the United States, only 6.1% of Americans lived in places with populations of greater than 2,500 people. At this time, only New York City and Philadelphia had more than 100,000. If we go 40 years in the future, about 1860, now we're seeing about 20% are going to live in areas greater than 2,500 people. Working in factories was an opportunity for everyone to have a chance to make money for the family. During this time, there was no such thing as children labor laws, so you could see individuals as young as 10, sometimes younger, working in factories for less than 10 cents an hour. Companies are also going to establish boarding houses so that families can move away from their family farms, can come to the city, live in a boarding house to be able to work efficiently. They would also establish general stores, so everything that you would need to survive is all going to be provided to you by the companies. So adults are going to earn as much in a day as children did in a week. During this time, your wages can really vary from about $2 to $4 a week, or in some situations, you'll get about $8 to $10 a week. And this is working 12 to sometimes 16 hours a day. And if you were going to be paying such low wages, the owners of the factories are going to reap huge profits. One individual that you guys are going to talk more about in 8th grade, especially when you focus about the men who built America, is an individual known as Rockefeller. He really got his money by establishing the Standard Oil Company, and there's a handful of other men that built America too, like Carnegie, and all of these individuals will be covered when you get to 8th grade, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about these individuals. Machines work better than people for a handful of reasons. The first, they build products faster, making it cost less, right? Kind of the idea here of mass production, and we'll talk about that later on in this slide. Remember that at the beginning of the history of the United States, all the textiles or clothing materials were done by hand, mostly by the women, only being able to turn out very small quantities of textiles. Now, with the thanks of machines, we're now able to see that increase tremendously thanks to the invention of steam-powered factories. B, if a part breaks down, you can just replace the broken part. I would like to apologize for the word now instead of down on the PowerPoint. I should have triple checked it before going through this lecture. The interchangeable parts idea, which we'll talk about towards the end of our lecture today, was established by Eli Whitney. Basically, interchangeable parts is that parts of the machines are built the exact same way. That makes it easier to replace, but also cheaper to replace. It's easier to replace a broken down machine than an individual that is no longer able to work in your factory. All of this is going to lead to the idea of mass production. Mass production is basically the fast production of large numbers of identical goods. This idea of mass production is going to be used all throughout the Industrial Revolution, and is still being used today. One company, Ford, was really a trendsetter in regards to the mass production and the idea of the assembly line, which allowed them to assemble and construct their Model Ts very quickly. Our second advancement is the idea of the steamboat. Very similar to the idea of a steam power factory, we are going to have some type of fuel, whether that's wood or coal, that is going to be able to produce the steam to be able to get those engines really humming, I should say. The steamboat was a great invention. During this time, if you were going to travel, let's say the Mississippi River, you can only go down the river or downstream. So an example would be you may be a farmer living in Illinois and you need to utilize the Mississippi River to sail down to the important port city of New Orleans. Most of the time you might just build a flatboat, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a flat surface in which you're going to use to navigate down the Mississippi River. Easy to go down, but very difficult to go back upstream, since you really didn't have any ways to get your flatboat back upstream. A lot of times the individuals would kind of sell their flatboat or break it down to sell into pieces, and then they're going to have to walk back home. Very time consuming. So during the 1800s, the United States is going to go through a period of rapid growth in speed and convenience in regards to travel because of these new different ways of transportation. The creator of the steamboat was Robert Fulton. He is going to test his first steamboat design in France in 1803. Several years later, he tests the first full-size commercial steamboat called the Clermont in the United States. On August 9, 1807, he decides that he was going to travel up the Hudson River against the current, in which the result was they handled it without any problem. Steamboats quickly caught on and became the preferred method of water transportation. Between about 1817 and 1820, the number of steamboats jumped from 17 to 69, and by 1855 it reached 272. Continuing on the idea of steam-powered, we're going to look at the steam-powered railroads or the steam-powered locomotives. This was also developed first in Great Britain in the early 1800s. Doesn't become popular in the United States until about the 1830s. One of the first steam-powered locomotives or railroads that we are going to see in the United States was built in 1830 by an individual named Peter Cooper, who is in charge of building a small but powerful locomotive that he names Tom Thumb. To show how awesome this steam-powered locomotive was, he decided that he was going to race up against a horse-drawn rail car. The race was intense. At the start of the race, the horse-drawn rail car gets off to the early start. But here comes this powerful locomotive, Tom Thumb, starts to pick up speed. It passes the horse-drawn rail car, and then it breaks down. However, it was an insight as to what could possibly happen if they continue to work on developing these steam-powered railroads. By about 1840, you're going to have railroad companies that are going to lay about 2,800 tracks a mile, and then about 1860, it's now up to 30,000 miles of railroad track. Laying railroads was a lot easier and cheaper compared to going through canals, right? In 1825, the Erie Canal was established. It'll be much later on into the Panama Canal is established, The idea here is that if we were able to rail railroads, we'll just lay it on the ground, and then we'll use the TNT when we need to in regards to going through mountains, or we can go around. On the board, we kind of see the red lines that indicate the development of the railroads. Mostly, as you can tell, is in the north. These railroads in the north are going to be utilized extremely well throughout the American Civil War, and we'll talk about that when we get there. By the mid to late 1800s, like the 1860s, the railroad companies are going to become one of the most powerful businesses in the United States, right? So think 1860, these railroad companies are going to have to lay about 30,000 miles of railroad track across the United States. Here are just some of the images provided to the railroad companies that were really able to benefit from the great profits they received from being part of the railroad industry. Steamboats and railroads were able to get goods to distant markets faster, easier, and cheaper. American trains hauled more freight than those in any other country. It really drops the cost of shipping down by 60 to 70%. Trains could travel about 20 miles per hour compared to a wagon that can go 2. Then we're really going to start to see towns that are going to pop up thanks to the idea of railroad stops being established. One example would be the idea of the Alton train station, which is no longer there, and also the train station located in Chatham, Illinois, are some examples of the towns that popped up thanks to the development of the railroads. So as we're focusing on steam power, we have to have some type of energy source that is going to put off steam to drive those pistons to not only work the factories, but the engines inside the steamboats and the steam railroad locomotives. At the start, it was going to be wood. Wood was the fuel for everything. It was used to power the trains, the steamboats. It was used for cooking, lighting your homes, and also for heat. As faster locomotives were built, we had to be able to replace wood since it would burn off rather quickly. So we turned to coal as our main source for not only our steam-powered locomotives, but our steam-powered factories and our steamboats. We're going to start to see mining pop up all throughout the United States. We'll start here in Pennsylvania, Western Virginia, and the wonderful state of Illinois, where we'll have new cities pop up as well, such as Coal City and Carbondale, that is a little bit more south here in the state of Illinois. Started to pop up thanks to the idea of coal mining. Coal was such a hot ticket because of how much energy it would produce. About a half a ton of coal produced as much as 2 tons of wood, and it also cost half the price. Our last real technological advancement that we're going to talk about deals with more of a communication revolution compared to the transportation and factory revolution. So Samuel F.B. Morse perfected the telegraph. Telegraph is spelled T-E-L-E-G-R-A-P-H. Sorry about that. So Samuel Morse and other inventors developed the telegraph, which revolutionized long-distance communication. It worked by transmitting electrical signals over a wire laid between 2 stations. We'll get to the Morse code here in a second. So the telegraph operator taps a bar, which looks like this, that controls the length of each electric pulse. It can be a long pulse, which will be a dash, or a short one, that would be a dot. On the other end of the wire, the pulses were changed to clicks. A short click would be a dot, and a long click will be a dash. This is the development of Morse code. The code assigns letters in the alphabet and numbers a set of dots, short marks, or dashes, long marks, based on the frequency of use. Letters used often, such as E, got a simple code as a dot, while those used less frequency, like a Q, got a much longer and complex code. This form of communication is going to be utilized not only in the United States, but also in Europe as well. In 1844, Morse sends his first telegraph message from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, Maryland. Then, In 1866, they attempt to lay a telegraph line between the United States and Europe going across the Atlantic. Although the telegraph had fallen out of widespread use by the start of the 21st century, just because of the fact it was replaced by the telephone, fax machine, and the internet. Backtracking, the first message that was sent was from Morse from, again, Washington to Baltimore, and the message says, "What hath God wrought?" Taken from the Bible, number 2323. Using the telegraph was quickly accepted by people eager for a faster and easier way of sending and receiving messages. However, widespread and successful use of the device required a unified system of telegraph stations among which information could be transmitted. Thanks to the Western Union Telegraph Company, founded in part by Cornell, was at first only one of the many such companies that developed around the new medium during the 1850s. By 1861, Western Union had laid the first transcontinental telegraph line, making it the first nationwide telegraph company. And to make it more convenient as to where they're going to go, the telegraphs are going to be established, the telegraph wires are going to be established next to the railroad tracks. They're also going to have many telegraph offices located inside of the railroad station. This could be used to inform the station that the train is arriving late or early or on time. The Continental Telegraph line will be completed in 1861. Not only will the railroad be utilized throughout the American Civil War, but also the telegraph will be utilized by the Union or the North to relay messages faster to the different regiments that are fighting in the Civil War. The real event that allows us to start to use machines and factories and the development of all the different types of advancements is thanks to the idea of interchangeable parts. In the 1840s, machines are able to produce interchangeable parts, which means machine builds something exactly the same. This whole idea was developed to produce enough rifles just in case there was going to be a war that broke out between the United States and France. I believe Eli Whitney made a promise to the President of the United States that he would be able to make 12,000 rifles in about 2 years. Unfortunately, he didn't really hit that quota at the start, but showing his work of interchangeable parts did show promise not only for producing weapons, but also for producing these different types of parts for the machines. This whole idea started by Eli Whitney, and we'll talk more about Eli Whitney when we get into the Southern Society, as we kind of look more into his other creation that really changed the world, especially in the southern part of the United States, where he went out and developed the cotton gin. What you are going to do tomorrow is you are going to complete a worksheet called Changes in Working Life. This really shows you what life was like if you were to move into the city and work in one of these steam-powered factories. You will have to use your textbook. There's page numbers in the worksheet. And don't forget that this worksheet is not due until Monday. We're going to cheat here. The 4th. Have a great day. Holla.